The hammer landed on the wagon wheel rim with a crack that split the dry Nevada air, and Grace Kendrick did not flinch. She had not flinched at much in her 26 years on this earth, and she was not about to start now, not in the summer of 1879, not with dust in her teeth and a broken axle threatening to ruin the last thing she had left in this world worth fighting for. The sun was already past its peak and dropping toward the red mountains to the west, and Grace was kneeling in the dirt beside the wagon her father had built with his own hands, trying to figure out if what she was looking at was fixable or final. She ran her fingers along the cracked wood where the wheel hub had split from the weight of everything she owned, which was not much, but it was hers, and that made it everything. She had come to Carson City from Missouri 2 years ago with her father, Thomas Kendrick, a man who believed that land could save a person the same way faith could. He had filed a homestead claim on 160 acres of high desert scrubland outside of town, a plot that sat between a dry creek bed and a rocky ridge that turned pink in the evening light. Thomas had worked himself into the ground, literally, because he had died the previous winter from a lung sickness that crept up on him so quietly that by the time Grace understood what was happening, there was nothing the doctor in town could do but shake his head and charge her $3 for the visit. She had paid the $3. She had buried her father herself, wrapped in his good blanket, under the single cottonwood tree on their property that actually got enough water to stay alive. She had been alone since February, and it was now the middle of July, and she had not cried once since the morning after the funeral. She did not think that made her strong. She thought it just made her practical. Crying did not mend fences, and it did not keep the coyotes away from her 2 remaining chickens, and it did not convince the bank in town that she was capable of making her land payment on time. But right now, her wagon was broken at the side of a road that connected Carson City to the smaller ranching settlements further east, and she had a load of fence posts in the back that she had traded 3 weeks of labor for, and she needed those fence posts on her property before she could finish the north pasture line, and she needed the north pasture line done before she could bring in the 2 milk cows she had agreed to buy from old Marion Hooper on a payment plan. And without the milk cows there was no income, and without income she was going to lose her father's land before the first snow. So Grace Kendrick knelt in the dirt, pushed her hair out of her face, and studied the problem the way her father had taught her, which was to look at what was broken before you decided what it needed. What it needed, she concluded, was a blacksmith, or a man with tools, or a miracle. What she got was a rider. She heard him before she saw him, the steady clopping of a horse moving at an unhurried pace from the direction of Carson City, and she stood up and turned around and shielded her eyes against the slanting afternoon sun. The rider was big in the shoulders, sitting easy in the saddle the way men did who had spent more time on horseback than on their own feet. His horse was a dark roan with a white blaze, and both of them looked like they had been on the road a while. The man wore a plain canvas coat despite the heat, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows, and his hat was brown and well worn and pulled low enough that she could not read his face until he pulled his horse to a stop about 10 feet from her wagon and looked down at her. He was somewhere around 30, she guessed. Strong jaw, dark eyes that caught the light in a way that was annoyingly direct, like he was not in the habit of looking away from things. A short beard that had not been attended to in maybe a week. He was not flashy. He was not the kind of man who announced himself. He simply stopped his horse and looked at the situation and then looked at her, and his expression said he was taking inventory. "Axle," he said. "Hub," she said. He swung down from the horse in one smooth movement and wrapped the reins around the wagon brake handle without being invited to, and then he crouched beside the wheel the same way she had, studying it the same way she had. She watched him run his thumb along the split wood. "You got anything in the back?" he said. "Fence posts? Metal work?" "No." "Yes." He stood up and looked at her, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something sympathetic or helpful in that empty way men sometimes did when they looked at a woman alone on a road and felt the need to demonstrate their competence. but he did not do that. "My name is Ira Bristol," he said. "I have a place about 4 miles east. I have tools." "Grace Kendrick," she said. "I have a broken wagon." Something at the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. "I noticed that." She looked at him steadily. She wanted to be clear from the beginning, because she had learned that clarity saved everyone a great deal of trouble. "I am not looking for charity," she said, "and I am not the kind of woman who needs rescuing, but I do need a functional wheel, and I am willing to work for the use of a workspace and tools if you have them." Ira Bristol looked at her for a moment like he was deciding something. Then he said, "What kind of work?" "Whatever kind you need done," Grace said. "I am not particular." He nodded once slowly, like that settled something. "My roof on the east end of the barn needs new shingles," he said. "I have been putting it off." "I can do shingles," she said. "You have done roofing before." "My father taught me," she said, and she kept her voice level when she said it because she had decided a long time ago that she was not going to be embarrassed by the fact that Thomas Kendrick had raised her to know how to do things with her hands. Ira Bristol said, "All right," and that was the entire negotiation. He helped her lift the fence posts out of the wagon bed so they could manage the weight. And then between the two of them, they got the wagon rolled to the side of the road, and he tied her 2 horses to a cottonwood and saddled the roan with a look that said he was going to do this in one trip, which meant he was going to ride back to his place for the tools and come back. He did not make a big show of this plan. He just turned the horse east. "I will be back before dark," he said. "I will be here," Grace said, because there was nowhere else to go. He was back in an hour and a half, which was faster than she had calculated, which meant he had pushed the horse harder than she expected. He had a wooden crate strapped behind the saddle with iron tools inside it, and he had a piece of replacement timber that was not quite the right size but could be worked down. He tied the horse and set down the crate and looked at the sky, which had gone orange along the edges. "Not enough light to finish tonight," he said. "No," Grace agreed. "I have a bunkhouse," he said. "Nothing fancy, but there is a cot and a stove that works." She looked at him. She had learned to read men fairly well, and what she read in Ira Bristol's face was not what she sometimes feared from strangers on empty roads. There was no calculation in it. He was simply solving a logistical problem the same way he seemed to solve everything else, directly and without decoration. "All right," she said. They worked until the light was completely gone, getting the broken hub loosened, and the wheel propped up properly on a flat rock so nothing would shift overnight. He knew what he was doing. She could tell by the way he handled the tools, efficient and unhurried, the way people moved when they had done something enough times that the work had gone into their hands and not just their heads. She worked alongside him and did not talk much, and he did not talk much, and it was not uncomfortable. She noticed that he did not try to take the heavier end of things away from her when she was already holding it. That was unusual enough that she marked it. They walked the 4 miles to his property in the dark, her horses following on their leads, and she saw the shape of his place by the light of a rising moon. It was not a grand spread. It was a solid one. The house was low and well built, the logs chinked carefully, a good porch with a proper roof over it. The barn was bigger than the house, which told her something about his priorities. There were several horses in the corral, good-looking animals, and a garden plot to the south side that had been attended to with real care. The vegetable rows were straight and the soil between them had been worked recently. "You do all of this alone," she said. "Mostly," he said. She did not ask what mostly meant, because it was not her business, and because she had enough of her own story to manage without collecting someone else's. The bunkhouse was off the back of the barn, a small clean room with a rope spring cot, a cast-iron stove, a single lantern, and a wooden peg on the wall for hanging things. It smelled like sawdust and dry hay and something faintly like pine sap. She had slept in worse places. She had slept in the wagon itself for 3 nights the previous month when the wind was wrong and the coyotes were particularly bold, and she had not wanted to leave the horses. He brought her a plate of beans and cornbread from the house, knocked on the bunkhouse door, and handed it to her without comment. The cornbread was good. She ate it sitting on the edge of the cot and then set the empty plate by the door and lay down with her boots on because old habits were practical ones, and she was asleep within 10 minutes. In the morning she woke before the sun and went out to look at the barn roof. The east end was bad. Several shingles had split or gone missing entirely, and she could see daylight through the gaps, which meant water could get in, which meant the loft hay was at risk. She walked around the whole roof line and made her mental inventory of what needed to be done. She found the shingle pile in the barn, a good stack of cedar, already split, which meant Ira Bristol had been intending to do this job himself at some point and had just not gotten to it. There was a ladder against the barn wall. She carried it to the east end and set it up and climbed it before he appeared. He came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee just as she reached the roof line and stood up, hands on her hips, looking at the damage from above. He stopped at the bottom of the ladder and looked up. "You started already," he said. "The light is good," she said. He looked at the 2 cups of coffee and then set one on the top rung of the ladder where she could reach it when she came down, and then he stood back and drank his own and looked up at her. "I will bring the tools up," he said. "That would be useful," she said. He climbed up after her with a canvas bag over his shoulder that held a claw hammer, a box of cut nails, and a small pry bar. He handed her the hammer first, and there was something almost ceremonial about it, the way he held it out to her handle first without preamble or commentary. She took it, and it fit well in her hand, a good weight, the handle worn smooth from use. Something happened in that moment that she did not have a name for right away. She stood on a barn roof in the early morning of a Nevada summer with a hammer in her hand and a man who had not tried to talk her out of being there, and she felt something rearrange itself inside her chest. Not something soft, not something sentimental. She was not built for soft or sentimental. But something shifted, the way a door shifts when you finally push it the right direction. Not dramatic, just a small and definitive movement. She did not say anything about it. She drove the first nail with 3 even strokes and pulled a split shingle free with the pry bar and reached for a fresh cedar one. And Ira Bristol worked 2 feet to her left, and they fell into a rhythm that required no conversation to maintain. Halfway through the morning he said, without looking up from what he was doing, "You have been working this land long." "A little over a year and a half," she said. "My father homesteaded it. He is gone." He said, and it was not a question exactly because he had heard the past tense she used. "January," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am sorry." It was the way he said it that surprised her. Not the words, because people said those words. It was the automatic social response to hearing about a death. And she had heard it 30 times since January from people in town and from neighbors and from the minister at the funeral. But Ira Bristol said it like he meant it specifically, like he was sorry for her, Grace Kendrick, and not just performing the correct social noise. She looked at him sideways and he was still working, not looking at her, giving her the space to absorb it or set it aside, whichever she needed. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it specifically too. They worked until the roof was done, which took them until past midday, and when they climbed down she felt the pull of muscles in her arms and shoulders that had been properly used, and she did not mind it at all. He looked up at the finished east end from the ground and nodded once, the way he did when he had decided something was satisfactory. "Good work," he said. "You had good shingles," she said. "I cut them myself," he said, and there was a quiet pride in it that she recognized, the kind that came from making something with your own hands. They went back to her wagon after lunch, which he made without ceremony, a pot of salt pork and dried beans on the stove in the house kitchen, eaten at a wooden table that had 1 chair on each side and nothing decorative about it at all. She noticed that the house was clean in the way that said someone cared about order, not in the way that said someone had cleaned it specifically for company. There were books on a shelf by the window, which she did not expect. She did not say anything about the books. At the wagon, The work was slower because fitting the replacement timber required shaping it properly, and he had a drawknife in his tool bag that he worked with precise and practiced focus. She held the wood steady when he needed it held and passed tools when he needed them passed, and they did not waste words. The afternoon light came in low and hot, and the cicadas ran their long sawing note through the air around them. And once a dust devil spun itself up about 100 yards to the south, and they both watched it for a moment before it fell apart. "You raise horses," she said, not a question, because she had looked at the corral and the barn and seen the quality of the animals. "I breed and sell them," he said, "mostly to the army, sometimes to ranchers. Good business. Steady," he said, "not the kind that makes you rich but the kind that keeps you honest." She thought about that. "Is that what you wanted when you came out here?" He looked at her, and there was something behind his eyes that moved through and settled. "I came out here after the war," he said. "I was not sure what I wanted, but I knew what I did not want, and this was the opposite of that." She did not press him on what he had not wanted, because she understood that there were things men did not talk about from the war years, things that had carved themselves into people and stayed there. She had been 14 when it ended, but she remembered the men who came back to their Missouri town, how some of them looked like they had been replaced with a copy of themselves that was slightly off, like something crucial had been taken out and not returned. The wheel was done by late afternoon, and together they loaded the fence posts back into the wagon bed, and she thought that was the end of it, that she would drive away and it would be simply a transaction, a roof for a wheel, fair and complete. But when she was gathering her horses' leads and preparing to hitch them up, Ira Bristol said, "Your property, is it north of the Henderson Road?" "About 2 miles north," she said. "I rode through that area last spring," he said. "The east boundary is unfenced." "I know," she said. "That is what the posts are for." He was quiet for a moment, coiling the rope from the hitching and not looking at her. "I could come by and help set them," he said. "I have a post-hole digger." She looked at him. She was aware that this was a different kind of offer than the one that had been made that morning. That morning had been a transaction. This was something else. "I told you I am not looking for charity," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not offering it. I need to ride that way anyway. I have a horse I promised to show a rancher out on the Paiute Meadows Road, and your place is between here and there." She was not entirely sure she believed that the timing was as convenient as he was describing it, but she also could not prove it was not true, and there was something in her that did not want to drive away from him quite yet, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that, even if she was not going to say it out loud. "All right," she said. "Saturday morning." "Saturday morning," he said. She drove the 4 miles back toward town with the fence posts rattling in the wagon bed, and the evening coming in pink and gold behind her, and she thought about the way the hammer had felt in her hand when he passed it to her on the barn roof, the weight of it, the solid reality of it, and she thought about that small internal shift and tried to examine it the way she examined broken things, looking for what it was and what it needed. She could not figure it out yet. She let it be. Her property was not beautiful in the conventional sense. It was high desert, which meant it was demanding in ways that polite land was not. The soil was thin over rock in some places and heavy alkaline clay in others, and the summers were violent with heat, and the winters came in hard and stayed. But it was hers. The cottonwood by her father's grave was the most graceful living thing on the property, and in the evenings when the light went sideways, it turned the leaves silver on one side and deep green on the other, and Grace had learned to find that beautiful enough. She spent Thursday mending the chicken coop and Friday hauling water from the well to her kitchen garden, which needed more water than the desert naturally provided and always would. She had planted sensibly, drought-hardy things, squash and dried beans and root vegetables that could go deep for moisture. Her father had tried corn the first year and she had not made that mistake. She thought about Ira Bristol more than she intended to. Not in a soft way. Not in a mooning, sighing sort of way, because she was not built like that and she knew it. She thought about him the way she thought about problems she was trying to solve, turning the thing over and looking at the different sides of it. He was competent. He was direct. He did not talk more than the situation required, and he did not try to manage her. Those were remarkable qualities in her experience, particularly the last one. Saturday morning he arrived at 8 o'clock with the post-hole digger tied across his saddle, and a second horse trailing behind him that he used as a pack animal, carrying a bag of supplies she had not asked him to bring. She saw flour and salt pork and a tin of coffee, and she started to say something about the transaction terms they had agreed on, and he looked at her with those direct dark eyes and said, "I was at the store anyway." She decided to accept it because arguing about it would take more time than setting fence posts, and she wanted the fence posts set. They worked the fence line from the corner of the northeast boundary south toward the road, and the post-hole digger was essential because the ground was hard enough that her own bar and shovel method had been brutal slow work. Ira made it look not easy exactly, because it was not easy, but efficient. He dug and she set posts, and between them they found a pace that covered ground. He did not tell her how to set the posts. He did not inspect her work to see if she had done it correctly. He assumed she had. By noon they had 20 posts set in a straight line that she was proud of. They ate lunch under the single cottonwood, and it was the first time she had sat under that tree with another person since her father died, and she was aware of that, the weight and significance of it, though she did not say so. He ate his salt pork and bread without complaint and looked out over the property with the considering expression she was beginning to recognize as simply how he looked at things when he was paying attention. "Your father built the house," he said. "We built it together," she said. "He designed it. I did a lot of the work." She paused. "He was sick that first autumn, even if we did not know yet how sick, so I did more than was originally planned." "You have been running this place most of a year then," he said. "About that," she said. "You are doing well with it," he said, and it was stated as an observation rather than a compliment, which was why she believed it. "I am keeping it alive," she said. "That is not the same as doing well." "No," he agreed, "but it is the necessary thing first." They sat in silence for a while that was entirely comfortable, which was another unusual thing. Grace had spent most of her 26 years in the company of people who felt the need to fill silence with noise, and she had always found that exhausting. Ira Bristol seemed to understand that silence was not a problem requiring solution. A hawk made wide, slow circles above the ridge to the east, riding the heat that came off the rocks, and they both watched it for a while. "Can I ask you something?" she said, and he looked at her and waited. "You said you had mostly been doing this alone. What does mostly mean?" He looked at the cottonwood for a moment, at the grave marker at its base, which was a flat piece of slate she had carved her father's name on with a chisel. Then he said, "I had a wife. She died 4 years ago. Fever." Grace took that in quietly. "Children," she said. "No," he said, and there was a complete sentence in that single word. Things she did not ask about because the way he said it was the way you said the thing that hurt the deepest. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it specifically. They went back to work after that, and the afternoon went the way the morning had, productive and quiet, and by the time the sun was going down, they had the north fence line staked from one end to the other. She still needed to run wire, but that was the next problem, and she had already solved enough problems for one day. He stayed longer than he needed to, helping her move the remaining fence posts to the storage side of the barn so they would not get rained on, though rain was more theoretical than practical in July in Nevada. But she let him stay because she wanted him there, and she had decided that wanting him there was not a weakness. It was just an honest feeling, and she had enough practice with honesty that she could apply it to herself as well as to the rest of the world. When he finally made ready to leave, saddling the roan and collecting the pack horse's lead, she stood in front of the barn and watched him and said, "You are welcome back." He turned and looked at her, sitting up on the horse with the evening light behind him making him look like something painted on the sky. "Is that an invitation?" he said. "It is a statement of fact," she said. "Whether you take it as an invitation is up to you. The corner of his mouth did the thing it did when he was almost smiling. "I will bring the wire next time," he said. "I have extra." "I will pay you for it," she said. "We can discuss it," he said, which was not agreeing and was not disagreeing, and she let it be. He came back the following Wednesday with the wire, and they did not discuss payment, but she made him a proper supper of rabbit stew with root vegetables from her garden and biscuits, and he ate all of it, and said it was the best meal he had eaten in some months, which she thought was probably true, and also probably the nicest thing he was capable of saying, and she found both of those things together deeply appealing. They sat on her porch after supper, which was really just 2 chairs she had built herself from rough lumber, functional but not graceful, and watched the stars come out over the desert the way stars did in Nevada, dramatically, as if they were announcing themselves to the empty land below. "Tell me about Missouri," he said. "Flat," she said. "Green. Loud with frogs in the summer. My mother's people were farmers 3 generations back. My father's people were tradespeople, a blacksmith on one side and a millwright on the other." She paused. "My mother died when I was 11. My father raised me after that." "So it has been you and him," he said. "Yes," she said, "for a long time." She looked at the stars. He was a good man, not a perfect one. He was stubborn and he had opinions about things that were none of his business, and he was not always good at saying the direct thing when the indirect thing was more comfortable. But he was honest and he worked hard and he loved me in the way that decent fathers love their children, which is to say without condition and without fully understanding who I actually was, but trying. Ira was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like enough," he said. "It was," she said. "It was enough." He looked at her then directly, the way he did everything, and she looked back at him and felt the thing in her chest that she had noticed on the barn roof do something additional, a further small movement, as if that door she had identified was continuing to open by degrees, slow and inevitable. "I should tell you something," she said, because she had decided that clarity was the right policy and she intended to maintain it. "All right," he said. "I am not soft," she said, "and I am not sentimental. I have been told that this is a problem by people who thought they knew better, and I have decided that those people were wrong. I know what I am, and I think it is not a disadvantage. I will not pretend to be otherwise for the sake of anyone's comfort. If that is something that does not suit you, it is better to know it early." Ira Bristol looked at her for a long moment in the starlight. He was not startled or annoyed or any of the things she had seen on men's faces before when she said things like this. He looked, if anything, like he was recognizing something he had been looking for. "Good," he said. She blinked. "Good." "Good," he said again, and he was not elaborating, he was just confirming. "I have had enough of things that break easily. The last thing I need is something else that needs careful handling." She stared at him for a moment, and then something she could not prevent happened, which was that she laughed. Not a polite laugh or a social laugh, but a real one, genuine and brief and unguarded, and she could hear how rare it was in her own ears, and she suspected he could hear it too. He smiled then fully, for the first time she had seen it, and it changed his whole face into something younger and warmer than the serious jaw and direct eyes had suggested was available. "I will ride back before it is too late," he said. "It is already late," she said. "I know," he said. He rode back anyway, and she sat on the porch for another 20 minutes looking at the stars and thinking about the word good, how he had said it and what he had meant by it, and whether she was the kind of woman who was capable of letting that matter to her. She concluded that she was, reluctantly, but she was. Over the next 3 weeks Ira Bristol became a regular presence on her property in the way that happened organically, when 2 competent people found themselves useful to each other and also interested in each other's company, without either of them being willing to be obvious about the second part. He came 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with supplies or tools, sometimes empty-handed and simply because the road to his place from town went by hers, and stopping in required only a small deviation. He helped her run the wire on the fence, and then he helped her build a proper gate for the north end. And then one afternoon he looked at her chicken coop, which she had been maintaining in a state of functional dilapidation, and said without being asked that he would bring lumber for a new one. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. He brought the lumber. While they built the new coop, she told him about the milk cow plan, about Marion Hooper and the payment arrangement, and he listened without interrupting and without offering his opinion on her plan until she asked for it. "Is it a sound plan?" she said. "It is," he said. "Marion Hooper is reliable. Her cows are good stock. The income from the milk and butter will carry you through winter if you are careful." "I am always careful," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him over the half-built frame of the coop and thought that here was a man who was paying attention, not just being polite but actually listening and actually thinking about what she said. And that was so unusual in her experience that it still surprised her every time she noticed it. One evening in early August, 3 weeks after they had met on the road, she rode out to his property for the first time since the first night, to return a set of tools he had left behind after the fence work. She could have waited until he came by, but she told herself it was efficient to return them promptly, and if there was another reason, she was not going to examine it too closely. She arrived to find him in the corral working a young horse, a sorrel filly that was clearly not yet comfortable with a rider but not yet fighting it either, just at that uncertain tipping point where the right handling made all the difference. She leaned on the fence rail and watched him work. He was patient with the horse in the way he was patient with everything, not forcing anything, just being consistently present and consistent in what he expected. And gradually, over 20 minutes of watching, she saw the filly's neck relax and her ears come off the flatback position, and she began to move with Ira rather than against him. It was instructive, watching this. Not because she did not know about horses, but because she had rarely seen a person handle anything with that particular quality of patience, which was not passive but was not aggressive either. It was just persistent, sure of itself without being hard about it. When he brought the filly back to the rail and saw Grace, he looked momentarily surprised, which was the first time she had seen anything close to surprise on his face, and then he was back to his usual expression. "I brought your tools," she said. "Thank you," he said. He swung down from the filly and stroked her nose once, a brief gesture that was matter-of-fact and genuine, and then looped the reins over the rail. He looked at Grace. "Have you eaten?" "Not yet," she said. "Come in then," he said. In the house kitchen she looked at the books on the shelf while he put supper on. There were more than she had initially noticed: a Bible that looked well used, a copy of the History of Nevada Territory that was newer, several almanacs, 2 novels that she could not read the spines of from where she was standing. She crossed the room and tilted her head to read them. "Dickens," she said. "You read Dickens. Is that surprising?" He said from the stove. "A little," she said. "I had a lot of winters alone," he said. "Books help." She pulled one of the novels off the shelf, the David Copperfield, which was thick and worn at the spine, and looked at the pages inside. He had made small marks in the margins in some places, pencil lines, and in one place a single word written beside a passage that said simply, "Yes." She put it back carefully. "What was the passage?" she asked. He turned from the stove and looked at her. "Which one?" "The one where you wrote yes." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I do not remember now." But the way he said it suggested that he did remember and that it was something private, and she let that be, because she understood private things. Supper was quieter than usual that night, but not uncomfortable. There was something in the air between them that had been building over the weeks and was now closer to the surface than before, not quite arrived, but near. She was not someone who rushed at things. She had never been impulsive, or if she had been, life had worked it out of her. But she was also not someone who pretended not to see what was plainly there. When she made ready to leave and he walked her out to her horse, the evening air was cooler than it had been for weeks, carrying the first suggestion that August might eventually give way to something kinder, and she stood by her horse in the gathered dark and looked at Ira Bristol and said, "You know what I think is happening?" He was very still. "I think I do," he said. "I am not going to pretend I am not aware of it," she said. That seems dishonest. It does, he agreed. I am also not ready to rush at it, she said. I have managed alone long enough that I am not easily convinced I need anything else. So if this is going to become something, I would like it to become what it actually is, and not what people decide it should be. Ira looked at her in the dark, and something in his face had opened further than she had seen it open before, a controlled man allowing himself a small but real form of vulnerability. I am not in a rush either, he said. I have been here 6 years, and I have not found a person I wanted to spend time with until very recently. She took that in. Until very recently, she repeated quietly. Until approximately 2 weeks ago this past Wednesday, he said, with a precision that was so characteristic of him that it nearly made her smile. That is a very specific memory, she said. I have a specific kind of mind, he said. She looked at him for one more moment and then she took her horse's reins and swung up into the saddle. I will see you Friday, she said. Friday, he confirmed. She rode home in the warm dark and felt that thing in her chest moving again, more significantly now, a door opening wider, and she thought that if she had been a different kind of woman she might have called it something poetic. But she was Grace Kendrick, and she called it what it was, which was that she was beginning to trust a person, and that trust was turning towards something she did not have a word for yet but was not afraid of having. In September she picked up the 2 milk cows from Marion Hooper and brought them to her property, and the following morning she drove to town to make the first payment to the bank, and the bank manager, a trim, dry man named Aldous Perkins, looked at the money and then looked at her and said, I see you have continued to manage, Miss Kendrick. He said it with a kind of thin, surprised pleasure, the way men of that sort said things when a woman did something they had privately doubted she was capable of. Grace said, yes, and took her receipt and left because she had not come there to perform for his approval. She told Ira about the bank payment that Friday and he said, good, in his particular way, and she realized she had come to understand the different weights of that word from him, how good could mean satisfactory, or how good could mean I knew you could, and how good could sometimes mean I am glad for you in a way that does not require elaboration. This particular good was the last kind. She was learning his vocabulary. That seemed important. October came in with a wind off the mountains that meant business, and with it came a problem she had not fully anticipated, which was that her roof, which had been fine in the dry summer, revealed itself to have a weakness on the west side that became very clear during the first real rainstorm of the season. She discovered it at 2 in the morning when water was dripping in a thin but persistent stream onto the floor 2 feet from her bed, and she put a pot under it and lay awake in the dark thinking about what it would take to fix it, and how much it would cost and what she had available. In the morning she went up to look at the west roof herself and saw that 3 of the shingles had cracked along old splits that the summer heat had widened, and the water was getting under the upper course and coming through. It was fixable. She had cedar shingles left in the barn from a split she had done the previous summer. She had the tools. What she did not have was a second pair of hands to hold the upper course while she worked the new shingles underneath, or someone to anchor the ladder on the steep side. She could have done it alone. She had done harder things alone. But she found herself, without deliberate decision, driving to Ira Bristol's place on a Thursday morning, and arriving to find him in the barn working with harness leather at a workbench near the door. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the thing it always did when she appeared unexpectedly, that brief soft quality that passed through before his face returned to its usual considered state. My roof, she said without preamble. Where? He said. West side, she said. He set down the harness leather. I have the morning, he said. They drove back in her wagon because it was easier to carry tools that way, and she drove while he sat beside her on the wagon seat, and they rode the distance in the comfortable near silence that had become their normal state, with occasional words dropped in when one of them had something worth saying. I heard a thing in town yesterday, he said at one point. What thing? She said. The Henderson Road is being considered for an extension north, he said. If it happens, it would run through the Paiute Meadows area. That would be good for ranchers out there, she said. It would, he said. It might also bring more people in, he paused, which is good for trade. And also brings certain complications. She looked at him sideways. You prefer fewer people, she said. I prefer fewer people who are not worth knowing, he said, which was not quite what she had expected him to say, and the particular framing of it settled somewhere warm in her chest. The roof took most of the morning, and it rained again that afternoon lightly, and the west side held perfectly. She stood inside and looked up at the ceiling and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing repaired correctly, and Ira stood beside her and looked up at it too, and their shoulders were almost touching in the small space. "Thank you," she said. "You would have done it yourself," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it was easier this way." He turned and looked at her, and they were very close, and she could see things in his eyes that he generally kept arranged behind his careful expression. Real things, present things, things that were about her specifically and not about the work or the weather or the abstract future. "Grace," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different from how it sounded in anyone else's mouth, lower and more deliberate, as if he had been thinking about how to say it. "Yes," she said. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I would like to court you properly, if that is something you will allow." She considered him. She thought about what properly meant coming from a man like Ira Bristol, which was that it would mean what it said and not something else dressed in polite language. "I am not sure I know how to be courted properly," she said. "I have not had much practice." "Neither have I," he said. "I would suggest we make it up as we go." "I can agree to that," she said. He nodded, once, slowly, and the quality of the air between them changed in a way that was unmistakable and also irreversible. The way certain things were once you had said them out loud. They could not be unsaid, and that was not frightening but clarifying. He had supper with her that evening, and they sat at her table and talked more than they usually did. Not about small practical things, but about larger things, about what they wanted, what they believed, what they had learned from loss that they were not sure they could have learned any other way. She told him that she had decided years ago, when her mother died, that she was not going to spend her life waiting for something. Her mother had been a woman who waited for her husband to become the person she needed him to be, waited for money to improve, waited for happiness as if it were something that would eventually arrive from an outside source. And Grace had watched that and decided she was going to move toward the things she wanted and away from the things she did not, as directly as she possibly could. Ira listened to all of this without interruption, and at the end he said, "And what do you want, now, at this particular time?" She looked at him across the table in the lamplight and said, "I think you know what I want now." He held her gaze and she held his, and neither of them looked away because there was nothing here that either of them needed to hide from. "I think I do," he said. He rode home that night, but he held her hand for a moment before he mounted, just held it, her hand in both of his, looking at it as if he was memorizing the shape of it, and then he let it go and rode away, and she stood in the cooling October air with her hand at her side feeling the warmth of it. She was not soft. She was not sentimental. But she was honest, and honestly she thought she was falling in love with Ira Bristol in the clearest and most real way she had fallen toward anything in her adult life. November brought the first proper cold, and with it came a series of events that Grace had not anticipated, but that tested what was growing between her and Ira in ways that turned out to be instructive. The first was a man named Clyde Rudd. Clyde Rudd was a neighbor of sorts, operating a cattle operation about 7 miles northwest of Grace's property, and he had been eyeing her land since before Thomas Kendrick died, seeing it as a natural addition to his own spread that he would eventually acquire by patience or by pressure. He was not a villain in any dramatic sense. He was simply a man who wanted things and was accustomed to getting them because he was large and confident and had money enough to make most problems go away. He rode up to her property on a Tuesday morning in early November with a proposal and a smile that was calibrated to charm and did not come close. "Miss Kendrick," he said, sitting on his big gray horse with the easy authority of a man who was rarely told no. "I have been thinking about your situation here." "Have you?" she said. She was standing in her doorway and she did not come down from the porch. "It is a hard thing for a woman alone," he said, "particularly going into winter. I would like to offer you a fair price for your quarter section, more than fair. You could take that money and go somewhere easier." She looked at him for a moment. "I do not want somewhere easier," she said. "That is what people say before the second winter," he said, with the smile still in place. "Mr. Rudd," she said, "this land belonged to my father and it belongs to me and it is not for sale. If you have something else to discuss, I am happy to hear it, but if this is the whole conversation, I think we are done." He looked at her steadily and the smile faded into something more considering. "I will be back in the spring," he said, "to see if you have changed your mind." "I will not have changed my mind," she said. He rode away and she went inside and stood at her kitchen window and breathed slowly and thought carefully about the situation. Clyde Rudd was not dangerous in an immediate sense, but he was the kind of persistent that could become a problem, and she knew that a woman alone holding a piece of land that someone powerful wanted was in a position that required more than just saying no. She told Ira about it that Friday, matter-of-factly, laying out the facts of the interaction without dramatizing them. Ira listened with his hands flat on the table, and his face going through several things before it settled on a careful, controlled expression. "He has done this before," he said. "There was a family named Estrada south of his range 3 years ago. He made offers until they accepted." "I am not the Estrada family," Grace said. "No," said Ira, "you are not." He thought for a moment. "Your land claim, is it properly filed with the land office in Carson City?" "Filed and recorded," she said. "My father was thorough." "Good," he said. "And the bank payment is current?" "Current and receipted," she said. "Then he has no legitimate avenue," Ira said. "He can make offers as long as he likes. He cannot compel a sale on properly held land." "I know that," she said. "I know you know it," he said. "I am just confirming that the legal position is solid." He paused. "If he becomes problematic, there is a marshal in Carson City." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and they both understood the subtext without stating it, which was that the law in 1879 Nevada was not entirely reliable as a shield for a woman holding land alone against a man with money and local connections, and that knowing your legal rights and having them respected were two different things. "I am going to ride out more often," Ira said quietly. She looked at him. "Ira," she said carefully, "I appreciate that. But I will not have you feeling that you need to come out of obligation or protection. That is not the arrangement between us." "It is not obligation," he said immediately. "I want to come out more often. This is a separate reason to do the thing I already want to do." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she nodded once, accepting this because it was honestly offered. "I should have something else to offer you in return," she said. "You already do," he said simply and left it there, and she did not push on it because she understood what he meant and she felt the same way and she was not going to pretend otherwise. He did ride out more often, 3 or 4 times a week through November and into December. And the riding was not always about work. Sometimes it was just sitting on her porch wrapped in their coats while the cold came off the mountains and talking about things, or not talking, reading separately by the fire, the comfortable intimacy of two people who did not need to perform for each other. She had never had that before. The particular easiness of being exactly who you were in someone else's presence without editing or effort. She had told him she was not soft and not sentimental, and she had meant it. But she was beginning to understand that there was a difference between sentimentality, which was the performance of feeling, and the actual having of feelings, which was simply an honest condition of being alive. She had feelings. She had always had them. She had just learned to carry them quietly and use them practically rather than spreading them around for display. Ira appeared to operate on the same principle. He was not a demonstrative man, not given to flowery speech or large gestures. But he was consistent in the ways that mattered, present when he said he would be, honest in what he said, attentive in the specific way that meant he was actually paying attention and not just performing attentiveness. Clyde Rudd came back in mid-December, as he had apparently promised himself he would, even if he had not said so to her. This time he came with another man, a thin one who said nothing but whose presence was clearly intended as a kind of ambient pressure. He made a second offer that was higher than the first, and Grace said no with the same directness she had deployed in November, and he said things about the difficulty of the coming winter and the wisdom of knowing your limits that were just short of threats, and she said, "Good day, Mr. Rudd," and went inside and let the door close. Her heart was beating harder than she liked when she heard his horse leave, but she was not frightened exactly. She was angry. There was a significant difference. She wrote down the date and the substance of the exchange in a small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer, the same way she recorded every financial transaction and every weather event and every significant thing that happened on the property. Her father had taught her that records were more valuable than memory, and she had taken that lesson seriously. Ira, when she told him, said, "2 visits in 2 months. He is not deterred." "No," she said. "Would you be willing to come to town with me next week?" He said, "There is a solicitor I know who works out of the land office building. I think it would be useful for him to know your situation." "A solicitor costs money," she said. "He owes me a favor," Ira said. "Let me use it." She looked at him. She wanted to refuse on principle because her principles told her that her problems were hers to solve. But she had been learning, slowly and specifically through her experience of Ira, that accepting help from people who genuinely offered it was not weakness, it was pragmatism, and she had always been practical above all things. "All right," she said. They drove to Carson City the following Tuesday, and she noticed when they arrived on the main street that people looked at them, at Ira on his horse and Grace in the wagon beside him, and that their looking communicated things that people in small towns communicated about men and women who appeared together regularly. She was not embarrassed by this. She simply noted it as a fact of her current social situation. The solicitor, a compact, weathered man named Everett Church, received them in a small office that smelled of paper and pipe tobacco, and listened to her account of the Rudd situation with the careful attention of someone who was being professionally useful. He reviewed her homestead claim documents, which she had brought in an oilskin folder, and told her they were correctly filed and the land was unambiguously hers, and that Clyde Rudd had no legal basis for any claim, and that if he made any approach that crossed into intimidation, she should document it carefully and bring it to him. "I have been documenting it," she said. He looked at her with something like approval. "Good," he said, and she heard Ira's word in his mouth and thought of the difference in how it landed from different people. On the way out of town, they stopped at the general store for supplies, and she ran into Marion Hooper, who was old and sharp-eyed, and had seen everything there was to see in Carson City for the last 20 years. Marion looked at Grace and then looked at Ira and then looked back at Grace with the frank appraising expression of a woman who did not bother with social filters. "Ira Bristol," Marion said. "I did not know you two were acquainted." "We have been neighbors since July," Grace said. "Neighbors," Marion said, in a tone that carried a great deal of editorial content. "Good neighbors," Grace said, which was perfectly accurate and also did not invite further editorial. Marion looked pleased with herself for reasons Grace did not entirely understand, and then bought her flour and left. On the wagon seat on the way home, Ira said without inflection, "Marion Hooper was a friend of my wife's." "I did not know that," Grace said. "She has been watching me since Sarah died," he said, "to see if I was managing." "And were you?" "More or less," he said. "Better recently." She felt the warmth of that land in her chest and stayed with it for a moment before she said, "She approved of the way she looked at you." "I think she did," he said. Grace looked at the road ahead and the mountains beyond it, white-capped now with the December snow that was building up on the higher elevations. "Your wife," she said carefully, "Sarah, will you tell me about her?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said she was kind. Genuinely kind, the kind that is a character trait and not a performance. She was also funny in a quiet way that snuck up on you. We had 2 years together. He paused. She would have liked you. Would she? Grace said. She appreciated people who were honest, he said. Grace thought about a woman named Sarah who had been kind and funny, and who had left Ira Bristol alone for 4 years to be careful with his tools and his horses and his handful of books. And she felt a complicated thing that was partly grief on his behalf, and partly gratitude, and partly a kind of solemn awareness that she was here because of all the things that had happened before her. All the arriving and departing that had brought two people to a broken wagon on a Nevada road in July. "I am glad to know about her," she said. "Thank you for telling me." "Thank you for asking," he said. Christmas passed quietly. She did not have family to visit, and neither did he. And by unspoken mutual agreement they spent it together. Her at his place for the actual day, where he had made a proper effort at a holiday meal. Roast chicken with preserved peaches and a fresh-baked pie that was only slightly lopsided and was excellent in spite of it. He had not made a fuss over decorating, but there was a small branch of juniper in a jar on the table that smelled like the desert at its best, and she touched the needle leaves of it and thought that this was what she would remember about her first Christmas in Nevada that felt like something instead of just an absence. He gave her a gift, a small folding rule made of boxwood and brass, the kind a craftsman used for precise measuring, good quality, clearly chosen with thought. She held it in her hands and opened and closed the folding joints and looked at it. "You always estimate," he said. "I have noticed. You are usually right, but you could be more precise." She laughed, genuine and unguarded. "This is the most practical gift I have ever received," she said. "I thought it would suit you," he said. She had made him something. A pair of work gloves from the best leather she had been able to find in town, cut and stitched by hand over 3 evenings when she was alone, sized to his hands because she had observed his hands carefully enough over the months that she knew their dimensions. He put them on and flexed his fingers and looked at them, and then looked at her with an expression she had come to understand was his version of being moved. "You made these," he said. "My mother taught me some things before she died," she said. "Leather work was one of them." He looked at the gloves for another moment, and then he crossed the room and stood in front of her and took her face in his gloved hands, gently, and kissed her for the first time. And it was not tentative or cautious, but it was gentle, deliberate, full of the same quality of attention he brought to everything. And she put her hands on his arms and kissed him back, and felt all of the internal shifting she had been experiencing for 5 months arrive at a kind of destination. A place where the door had finally opened all the way, and she was standing in the light on the other side. When they separated, he looked at her and she looked at him, and it was one of those moments that would stay in her memory her whole life, not because it was dramatic but because it was true. "I love you," he said, plainly, like a fact. She took that in and gave it the weight it deserved, which was considerable. "I know," she said, and then, because honesty was her whole operating principle, "I love you too." He almost smiled. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. January was hard in the way Nevada January was hard, cold and relentless, and requiring constant attention to practical things. Keeping the animals watered despite frozen troughs, keeping the house warm enough to prevent the damage that hard freezes did to plumbing and foundations, keeping the road passable enough to get to town when necessary. She and Ira developed a system without formally discussing it, checking on each other every 2 or 3 days, sharing the work of keeping 2 properties functioning through the brutal months. Clyde Rudd made no approach in January, which she attributed to the weather making long rides less appealing, and she was glad for the reprieve even as she knew it was temporary. In February, on a day that was unusually clear and still with a cold blue sky above the white desert, Ira rode over on a Tuesday morning when she was not expecting him and stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "I have something to ask you." She looked at him. He was not nervous exactly, because Ira Bristol did not do nervous, but there was an unusually careful quality to his stillness that told her he had been sitting with this for a while. "Come in out of the cold," she said. He came in and she put coffee on and they sat at her table and he looked at his hands for a moment and then at her. "I want to marry you," he said, "if you are willing." She looked at him steadily. She felt the thing in her chest that had been shifting and opening and arriving now settle into something solid and permanent, like a foundation poured and set. "Tell me what you mean by it," she said. "Tell me what kind of marriage." He nodded because he had expected her to ask this, she could tell. "An equal one," he said. "Your land stays yours. My land stays mine. We work both places together. No one tells the other what they can and cannot do with their own property or their own person. If you want to build a house on your land or plant a field or take a trip, you do not need my permission. You do not need anyone's permission for anything that is yours to decide." She looked at him for a long time. "That is not how most marriages work," she said. "I know," he said. "I think most marriages are less honest than they could be." He paused. "Sarah and I were equals. I know what it looks like and I know it works. I want the same thing with you if you will have it." She felt something she almost never felt, which was the particular warmth of being fully understood by another person, not partially, not with caveats, but completely. He had looked at her, all of her, the competence and the independence and the unwillingness to be anything other than exactly what she was, and he was not asking her to change any of it. He was asking to be alongside it. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, you will marry me." "Yes," she confirmed. The corner of his mouth went to the place where the smile lived before it was fully expressed, and then the smile arrived completely, and she thought for the 100th time that, when he smiled, it was the most genuine thing she had ever seen on a human face. They were married in March, in the Carson City courthouse, because Grace had no interest in a large production, and Ira had no interest in one either. Marion Hooper and Everett Church served as witnesses, and Marion cried, which Grace had anticipated, and Ira shook Everett's hand with the particular gravity of a man who understood what was happening, and Grace signed the register in her clear, deliberate handwriting, and felt the thing she had been building toward since a hammer was placed in her hand on a barn roof settle into its permanent form. They did not go anywhere for a wedding trip because it was early spring, and both properties needed attention, and they were practical people. Instead, they went to her house, which they had decided would be the main house because it was on her land and her land had been the thing worth fighting for from the beginning. And they had supper together and sat on the porch despite the cold and looked at the stars, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, which was not a thing she generally did, but which felt, in this particular moment, exactly right. Spring brought its own complications. The ground thawed and the work of both properties expanded into planting season and foaling season for the horses, and the ongoing business of maintaining the infrastructure of two places that were now functionally one. They found the rhythm of it, who did what on which days, how to manage the distances between the properties, when it was efficient to work together, and when it was more practical to divide. Clyde Rudd came back in April, the third visit, and this time he found not Grace alone on the porch but Grace and Ira both, and the calculation on his face when he saw Ira was readable from 20 feet away. He made the same offer in a slightly different arrangement of words, and Grace said the same no in slightly different phrasing, and Ira stood beside her and did not say anything at all, which somehow communicated more than words would have. Rudd looked at Ira for a moment and said, "Bristol," acknowledging him flatly. "Rudd," Ira said with exactly the same weight. After Rudd rode away, Grace said, "He will not come back." "No," Ira agreed. "He was looking for a woman alone. The calculation has changed." She thought about whether to be bothered by this, the fact that Rudd's decision had more to do with Ira's presence than with her legal position or her own determination. And she decided that she was not bothered by it, because she had not married Ira to have a shield. She had married him because she loved him, and if his presence happened to rearrange the calculations of men like Clyde Rudd, That was simply an incidental benefit of a choice that had been made on entirely other grounds. He was wrong from the beginning anyway, she said. The land was never going to be for sale. I know, Ira said. I want to plant another quarter of the south field this year, she said, moving immediately to the next thing, which was very much her way. Alfalfa. It would feed the milk cows through winter and I could sell the surplus. Good idea, he said. I will help you break the ground. I know, she said, because she did know. And that was one of the things she loved about him, not that he helped but that the help was simply assumed, a natural extension of their being a unit, no special credit required. That summer she discovered she was pregnant. She told Ira on a Thursday evening at his barn, because she had been over there working with one of the mares and the news had been sitting in her for 3 days while she decided how to say it. She said it directly, the way she said everything, standing by the stall door with hay on her sleeve. His face went through several things rapidly, none of which he tried to control, which was unusual. She saw something cross his face that she thought might be grief, a flash of it, because she knew he had lost children with Sarah that he did not speak of, the not yet arrived kind, the ones who left before they were here, and she thought he was perhaps briefly in that grief before he arrived at the present. Then he looked at her with an expression that was open in a way his face rarely was, fully present, fully real. He crossed to her and put his hands on her face the way he had at Christmas, and he looked at her for a long moment. "Are you well?" he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Are you frightened?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I do not think I am." She paused. "Should I be?" "No," he said. "I do not think so either." And he kissed her forehead, which was so tender and so uncharacteristically demonstrative that she felt the back of her throat do something unexpected. She was not going to cry, but it was close, and she let it be close without apology. The baby was due in the late winter, and she intended to keep working through the pregnancy as long as her body cooperated with that intention, which it did, because she was healthy and strong and had spent 2 years on this land making herself stronger. She worked the alfalfa crop through the summer and managed the milk cows and helped Ira with the horses when she could, and generally did not modify her life significantly, until October when the weight began to change her balance, and she had to be more deliberate about things like ladders. Ira was attentive without being overbearing, which was the distinction she had feared would be difficult for him, and was not. He did not make her feel that she had become something fragile. He made her feel that she was doing something significant, which was a different thing entirely, and he treated the growing evidence of the pregnancy with the same matter-of-fact reverence that he treated everything real. Marion Hooper came out to visit 3 times in the fall, bringing food and advice, and a small blanket she had knitted in blue wool, because she said she had a feeling about it. Grace accepted the blanket and the advice in the spirit in which they were offered, which was genuine love from an old woman who had seen enough of the world to know what mattered. "You are happy," Marion said on one of these visits, looking at Grace with her sharp old eyes. "I am," Grace said, and the simplicity of that statement, the complete lack of qualification or caveat, was itself remarkable. She was happy, not in a loud or performed way, in the solid, permanent way that grew from honest ground. The baby came in February at the beginning of a clear, cold week, and it was a boy, healthy and loudly opinionated about his arrival, which Grace took as a favorable indicator of his general character. Ira was in the house during the birth, which was not the conventional arrangement, but was the one Grace had decided on, because she was not going to have him waiting outside like a stranger to a thing that was happening to both of them. He held her hand when she needed it and stayed out of the way when she did not, and he was there when the boy arrived. And she saw his face when he first looked at his son, and she was not going to describe that expression to anyone, because it was his and it was private, and it was one of the most real things she had ever witnessed. They named him Thomas Ira Bristol, for her father and for his, the 2 halves of where he had come from. Thomas was a solid, calm baby after his first indignant week, which seemed to have been about registering his protest at the conditions of arrival and then settling into acceptance. He nursed well and slept in reasonable intervals, and regarded the world from his cradle with an expression of serious appraisal that Grace recognized as belonging to both of his parents. She was back on her feet and doing work within 2 weeks, not because she was reckless but because being still made her restless, and because there was always work to be done, and because she discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she could hold a baby in one arm and do a remarkable number of things with the other hand. Ira came in one afternoon to find her standing at the kitchen table nursing Thomas with one arm and mixing biscuit dough with the other, and he looked at her with an expression that was part admiration and part helpless affection, and she said, "Do not look at me like that." "Like what?" he said. "Like I have done something remarkable," she said. "Women have been doing this for all of human history." "That does not make it less remarkable," he said, and he picked up a bowl and helped her with the biscuits, and that was as good a summary of their marriage as anything else. The land grew under their care over the following years. The alfalfa crop was successful enough that she expanded it, and the milk cow operation grew to 5 animals, which generated real income through the hard seasons. Ira's horse breeding business continued its steady work, the army contracts reliable and the ranching clients growing, and he brought 2 of the best colts over to Grace's land where the alfalfa pasture was. And between the 2 properties, they were building something that was not grand but was solid in the way that things built with both hands and honest intention became solid. Thomas learned to walk in the summer after his birth, on the hard-packed earth between the barn and the kitchen garden, and his first clear word was horse, which both his parents accepted as appropriate. He was a sturdy, observant child who watched the world with his father's particular quality of attention and moved through it with his mother's directness. And Grace thought, watching him, that children were more honest than grown people generally got credit for, that they showed you who they were before the world had a chance to convince them to be something else. She had a second child 2 years later, a girl they named Clara Me, who arrived in the spring with considerably less drama than Thomas had, and looked around the room with an expression of serene confidence that Grace found deeply funny. Clara was her opposite in some ways, quick to laugh, easy with strangers, comfortable with noise and chaos, but in the essential things, the willingness to try things and the refusal to be frightened by difficulty, Grace saw herself clearly. The years moved as years did, with seasons and work and small victories and occasional setbacks, and the general texture of a life being genuinely lived. The Henderson Road extension happened, eventually, and more settlers came into the valley, and Carson City grew, and the world around them changed in the way the world always changed, relentlessly, and without asking anyone's opinion. Clyde Rudd eventually sold his own operation and moved to California, and Grace heard this news from Marion Hooper with the mild satisfaction of someone who had been right about a thing she had always been certain of. Marion Hooper died when Thomas was 5, in the summer, peacefully in her own home, which was exactly how she would have wanted it. Grace attended the funeral and felt the loss of her as the loss of a woman who had known how to see people clearly and love them honestly, and she stood at the grave and thought about all the people who left, her mother, her father, Ira Bristol, who she had never met, and now Marion, and she thought that the leaving was inevitable, and that the answer to it was not to close yourself against it but to stay open anyway, because the alternative was to miss what was here while it was here. She felt Ira's hand find hers and she held it, standing in the Nevada sun by the grave of a good woman, and she thought about the hammer, the way it had felt in her palm on a barn roof 5 years ago, the weight of it, the solid rightness of it. She had not known then what was beginning. She had only known that something had shifted, a small and definitive movement, like a door that had been pushed the right direction for the first time. She knew now what it had been the beginning of. She stood in the summer light with her husband's hand in hers and her son, running between the grave markers with another child and her daughter on her hip, regarding the world with her serene confidence. And she thought that she had not been wrong about herself. Not soft and not sentimental, not in the way those words were generally meant. But she had been wrong about what that meant. She had thought it meant she was closed, and she was not closed. She had never been closed. She had simply been precise about what she opened for, and she had been right to be precise, because what she had opened for was exactly this, exactly real, exactly worth all of it. "Are you all right?" Ira said quietly there at the graveside. She looked at him, at his face that she knew better now than she knew any face in the world, the jaw and the dark eyes and the particular quality of attention that had been hers specifically for 5 years, and was still the most direct and honest attention she had ever been given. "I am," she said. "I am very all right." He squeezed her hand once, and she squeezed back, and Clara reached out from her hip to grab at Ira's coat, and he shifted naturally to take the baby from her arm without being asked, settling Clara against his chest with the ease of a man who had been doing that for 2 years and found it as natural as breathing. Thomas appeared at his knee demanding attention, and Ira put a hand on the boy's head without breaking the look he was still giving Grace. She thought about the property, about the alfalfa in the south field that was coming in strong this year, about the fence line that needed 1 new post on the northeast corner, about the 3 mares that would foal in October, about the biscuits she had left rising in the kitchen that would need to go in the oven before too long, about the way the cottonwood at her father's grave turned silver and green in the evening light, about the folding rule on her kitchen shelf that she used nearly every week, about the way Ira had looked the first time he met his son, about the way the word good sounded in his mouth in its various inflections, about all the hammers and all the nails and all the work that had built the life she was standing inside. She thought, my father was right. Land can save a person, not because it is land specifically, but because things you build with your hands, things you work for and fight for and keep in the cold and the dark and the drought, those things become part of you. And the people who stand beside you while you build them, those people become the most essential part of everything. She took Thomas's hand with her free hand and they walked together, the 4 of them, out of the graveyard and into the Nevada afternoon, and the mountains were pink at their tops where the summer sun was beginning to slide west, and the air smelled of sage and dust, and the particular clean emptiness of the high desert that she had come to think of as home. This was her life. Precisely this, all of it, from the broken wagon wheel to the barn roof to the hammer in her hand, to the man who handed it to her without explanation or preamble, as if it had simply always been hers. It had. She had just needed to arrive at it. And she had, and she did, and everything after that had been the building of a thing worth having, steady and sure. The way all the best things were, not dramatic, not soft, not sentimental, but real, honest, and built to last.